Hello, I'm Shannon Tiezzi, the editor at the Diplomat, and today I am thrilled to be joined by Professor Minxin Pei, who is the author of the recent book, The Broken China Dream: How Reform Revived Totalitarianism. Professor Pei, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Shannon.
So, as you probably guessed from the title, Professor Pei's book looks at how China, despite its era of reform and opening that began in 1979, has actually pivoted back toward a totalitarian version of government that we haven't seen since the Mao era. And Professor Pei has offered to answer some questions about the book. And I want to start with one that I think kind of gets to the heart of the issue, which is that Xi Jinping has brought China back to this level of totalitarian rule that we haven't seen since Mao. But also under Xi Jinping, the CCP is trying to redefine its governance system to say, actually, we are a democracy, what China calls a whole process people's democracy. So why do you think Xi and the CCP are so keen to embrace the title of a democracy when it's clear they want nothing to do with the substance of a democracy?
Uh, I think they realize that at the rhetorical level, uh, they are at a huge disadvantage because democracy as a value has truly become universal. All you need to do is to look at the formal name of North Korea, the Democratic People's Republic, right? So the country is probably the most what should I say, cruel, the most dictatorial country in the world, and still they would put democracy in their in the formal name of the country. I think in the case of Xi Jinping or the Chinese Communist Party, what they want to do is to counter the Western narrative. The Western narrative about China is that this is a country that is not democracy, despite its economic development. So they want to show, okay, we have whole process. We may not have elections, but everything else about the country is democratic. Obviously, this is very Orwellian. This is doublespeak. People in China don't buy this, but somehow, propaganda-wise, they think they have a countermeasure.
So your book covers a broad scope of history from the Deng Xiaoping era to Xi Jinping. I want to focus a little bit more on recent events under Xi. To what extent do you think China's return to totalitarianism is a product of Xi Jinping's personal ambitions? Or should this development be understood as a likely or maybe even inevitable result of the systemic flaws that were already in place by the end of the Hu Jintao era?
I think it's the latter. Xi Jinping, just as an individual, is an accident. You can say that because if you look at his trajectory until 2007, it was actually unclear whether he would be the next leader. His rise was primarily due to the factional conflict between his two predecessors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. He was a compromise choice. So in that regard, Xi Jinping himself was obviously an accident of the outcome, an accidental outcome. But he himself played a very important role because he ideologically and politically was committed to a form of totalitarian rule. And he was skillful enough, ruthless enough to bring it about. But the conditions for the return of a totalitarian leader were created long before Xi Jinping was picked as the leader. When you look at Deng Xiaoping and, of course, the post-Tiananmen era, I would put most blame on Deng Xiaoping. When you look at Deng Xiaoping's so-called reform and opening, one thing he was very, very firm about was to preserve the rule of the Communist Party. And in doing so, he actually kept intact most of the institutions of totalitarian rule. The party control of the government, the party control of the military, the party control of information, and to a lesser extent, the party control of the economy. these are all the institutional pillars of totalitarian rule. So all Xi Jinping needed to do when he returned to power and wanted to revive that kind of system, all he needed to do was to flip on the power switch, and then the system would spring back to life. We saw that happening very quickly a decade ago.
Now, you also note that this same Leninist system makes a continuation or deepening of economic reforms extremely unlikely, probably outright impossible. So, is there any way that the CCP can address the social discontent that's starting to bubble up over issues like income inequality, corruption, labor abuses, all issues that should, in theory, be at the core of a true socialist ideology?
Uh, I think today is much more difficult than, say, the 1980s. The 1980s, because the previous system was so rotten, was so inefficient, and the disaster created by Mao for the Chinese people and for the Chinese Communist Party itself was so devastating that any little improvement would give the party enormous political support, performance legitimacy. Today, it's a lot harder. The Chinese people have higher demands, and the tasks of economic reform are much more difficult politically, not sort of technically. What will, I think, if we are talking about addressing income inequality, making the economy much more efficient, we're really talking about dismantling some of these institutional pillars of communism, of totalitarianism. We're talking about making the party a lot smaller because the party is a parasite. The Chinese society, the party itself, 100 million people, a lot of them are supported by taxpayers' money. One question I always have, which I have not found answer to, is how is the party actually being funded? What is does the government budget actually support party activities? If it does, then the party obviously is a parasite on the Chinese society, Chinese people. There's this Communist Party tax levied on the Chinese people. So we're talking about a set of new, much more drastic, and fundamental reforms that would endanger the party's control of the Chinese economy and Chinese society. Obviously, the party is not going to commit political suicide.
Now, you noted that Xi Jinping is following in Mao's footsteps or trying to in a number of ways. But do you think that he actually enjoys a personality cult in the way that Mao did? I mean, Mao Zedong enjoyed fervent public adoration. Does Xi enjoy that same stature in Chinese public opinion? Or can we know, given the constraints on finding that out?
Yeah, I personally doubt the Chinese people view Xi Jinping in the same light as Chinese people in the 50s, 60s, and 70s looked upon Mao. I mean, I happened to grow up in China in the 60s and the 70s, and we knew that there was genuine popular worship of Mao. Because at the time, it was a very different China. There was no access to information. We did not know the kind of horrible things Mao did to the Chinese people. We did not even know 30 plus million people died during the Great Leap Forward famine. I mean, that made it possible for most Chinese people to worship Mao as a godlike figure. Today, Chinese society is totally different. So it is much more difficult to recreate a genuine Mao-like figure in Chinese society. But this aside, do we know whether Xi Jinping himself enjoys being a Mao-like figure? There are two separate questions. One is whether Chinese people view him genuinely as a Mao-like figure. And the other is whether he sees himself as a true sort of leader, charismatic, and so forth. The latter, probably the answer is yes, because all you need to do is to look at how how much press attention he's gobbling up. You open up the People's Daily, the front page is mostly about him. nightly TV news coverage, and he's the first Chinese leader who actually is now using a specialized limousine when he travels abroad. There are two Boeing 747s that would ferry his entourage and his specialized security equipment around the world. No other Chinese leader ever did that. So you could say that he probably enjoys being sort of a very revered, highly sort of, what should I say, visible leader.
So I want to end on a more forward-looking note. Um, do you think that the combination of the end of China's economic miracle and Xi Jinping's overreach politically is likely to force a change in the future, maybe in the same way that the excesses of Mao's final years did? So, in other words, yeah, should we expect another Deng Xiaoping with all
Well,
the caveats?
even though we do not know, because a lot of that depends on succession. But when you look at how the Chinese Communist Party has behaved in the past, the party's survival tops everything else. So, ironically, the worse the situation is at the end of the Xi's era, the more likelihood that the party would make a dramatic shift in direction. Because uh, uh, the party knows that it has to stay in power, whatever the costs in terms of shifting policy. But, probably by the time a lot of damage has been done.
Well, thank you very much for joining us today, Professor Pei. I would encourage anyone watching this to read the book because there's so much in there that we didn't have a chance to touch on. You can find the link in the description below, and we'll see you next time.